Parallel Journeys, Chapter 1: The Power and the Glory. Unlike our elders, we children of the 1930s had never known a Germany without Nazis. From our very first year in the Volksschule, or elementary school, we received daily doses of Nazism. These we swallowed as naturally as our morning milk. Never did we question what our teacher said. We simply believed whatever was crammed into us. And never for a moment did we doubt how fortunate we were to live in a country with such a promising future. It was a terrific time to be young in Germany. If you were a healthy teenager, if you were a patriotic German, if you came from an Aryan, non-Jewish family, a glorious future was yours. The Nazis promised it. You were one of Adolf Hitler's chosen people. You were part of his master race, whom he considered the highest class of human beings on earth. Hitler took special pride in his young people, members of the Hitlerjugend, Hitler Youth. The Nazis' national organization for young Germans were treated with respect and honor. Constantly, Hitler reminded them that one day they would rule the world. But if you were a young gypsy, a communist, or a Jehovah's Witness, or if you were handicapped in any way, your future was not so promising. To the Nazis, you were Untermenschen, low-class citizens. Worst of all, the Untermenschen in Hitler's eyes were the Jews. Alphonse Heck considered himself fortunate. He was one of the millions of German children who were Adolf Hitler's chosen people, his master race. Although Alphonse didn't have blonde hair and blue eyes, the Nordic Germanic look that Hitler liked most, still he was a German through and through. From his French ancestors, he had inherited his dark wavy hair and brown eyes. The Hecks had arrived from France more than 150 years before Hitler came to power. They had settled in the Rhineland region of Germany, close to the French border. For many generations, Alphonse's family had farmed near the town of Wittlich, raising grapes for the white wine that made the Rhineland famous. I was raised near the Mosel River in one of the most enchanting valleys of Germany by a grandmother who adored me. When I was just 6 weeks old, my parents moved to Oberhausen, a large industrial city, taking with them my twin brother Rudy. Grandmother talked them into leaving me with her temporarily until they got settled in their business. But the temporary stretched into a year, then two, then more. Yet, far from feeling abandoned by my parents, I always felt lucky to live on a farm in the beautiful German Rhineland. Rhineland Germans hated their French neighbors. French soldiers had occupied the Rhineland since Germany's defeat in World War I in 1918. The agreement that ended the war, the Treaty of Versailles, imposed very harsh terms on Germany and its people. One of the rules of this treaty was that the Germans could not rebuild their army and navy. Without a strong military, the Allies hoped to keep Germany from starting another war. To keep in training, German soldiers practiced with cardboard guns and wooden tanks. The end to military force also brought an end to military music. No longer were bands allowed to play the march music the German people loved so much. Worse yet, the Germans were forced to pay huge fines for the damage they had caused by starting World War I. The payments were part of the reason that Germany was broke in the 1920s. Men were out of work. Their families were out of food and out of hope. Money had been so worthless that people carried it around in wheelbarrows just to do their daily shopping. It took 4.2 billion German marks to equal a single American dollar. These were truly hard times. If Germany were going to recover, it would take a strong leader. The German people needed someone who could pull them out of poverty, restore their faith in Germany, and help them rebuild their lives. Since Germany's loss in World War I, Adolf Hitler had had dreams of leading the country to power once again. An Austrian by birth, Hitler had fought in the German army during the war. He blamed Germany's defeat not on the soldiers, but on the communists, the labor unions, and the Jews. Those who agreed with Hitler's ideas formed the Nazi Party, a political group who believed in National Socialism. Throughout the 1920s, the Nazis used force to try to seize control of the German government. When their efforts became too violent, Hitler was sent to prison. There he wrote Mein Kampf, My Struggle, in which he outlined his plans for the Nazi Party. In growing numbers, people were now listening to Hitler's ideas. He promised them a way out of poverty. He promised to restore pride in themselves and in their country, and perhaps, most important, he gave them someone to blame for Germany's troubles: the Jews. On January 30th, 1933, Germany at last proclaimed Adolf Hitler its leader. Alphonse Heck was 6 years old at the time. That Monday evening, our kitchen was crowded with family and neighbors. Only a few had radios at home, and none had one as powerful as ours. My grandfather had mounted an expensive Blaupunkt on a shelf above his favorite chair in the kitchen. I usually fell asleep there on his lap after the late news at 10 o'clock. Tonight, two of our neighbors stood nearly at attention as Hitler's raspy but strangely attractive voice filled the room. The tough, hard faces of these farmers began to glow. It was a night of great triumph for all Germans. You mark my words, my grandfather cried, waving his ever present pipe as we listened. They're going to hand this country over to that crazy Austrian. Do you really think he can pull it off? Asked Herr Kasper, our neighbor. Herr Kasper was close to losing his last 3 cows and what little was left of his vineyard. Well, he isn't going to perform any miracles, grandfather reasoned, but it's better than having the beastly communists take us over. Less than 2 years later, my grandfather and nearly all our neighbors were solidly behind Adolf Hitler. He had created jobs for nearly 6 million people. He had restored their pride in Germany. Why wouldn't they follow a man like this? How was Hitler able to make such miraculous changes? He took the government into his own hands. He didn't pretend to run the country fairly. What elections he did hold were rigged. Their outcome was decided far ahead of time to ensure that the Nazis got their way. Germany had become a dictatorship. Adolf Hitler was the dictator. On February 4th, just 5 days after he came to power, Der Fuhrer, the leader, spread a rumor among his people. The communists were attempting to seize the government. The rumor was a lie, but it gave Hitler the excuse he needed to issue a new decree for the protection of the German people. The decree allowed the Nazis to forbid meetings of other political parties. They could stop the printing of flyers, newspapers, books, or magazines that they felt might be harmful to the German people. By the end of the month, the government had taken away the right to free speech, a free press, the right to gather in public places, and the right to privacy, the most important rights of people in a free country. Germany no longer was a free country, but few people seemed to care. Men were back at work earning money once again. Families had food on the table and clothes in the closet. For most, these benefits were much more important than the right to privacy or the right to speak out in public. No one cared or dared to speak out against Adolf Hitler. We children never had a chance unless our parents were brave enough to resist the Nazi tide. Few adults were. Most Germans willingly followed Adolf Hitler when they saw what changes he was making. Perhaps I would not have been such a firm follower if I had been raised by my parents. My father hated the Nazis with a passion, and he turned my twin brother against them too. But our farm was 200 miles away, so I didn't see my parents often. My grandparents, aunts, and uncles who lived on the farm with us had no strong political beliefs, but they were impressed with Hitler's success. He had brought jobs and economic order to a beaten down nation. He had given a country with a huge inferiority complex a reason to be proud of itself. I remember my grandmother saying one night, "You've got to hand it to Hitler. He talks big, but he puts everybody to work, even the blasted gypsies." In her eyes, there was nothing worse than idleness. The storm of Hitler's changes continued, often with a fury. In April, he held a secret meeting with his leaders at the Reich Chancellery, government headquarters of the Third Reich. The Reich was what the Nazis called their new empire. This was the third great Reich in German history, and Hitler believed it would last 1,000 years. At the Reich Chancellery meeting, he announced his plan to wipe out Christianity in Germany, root and branch. The churches, he said, could take command of the German people in the afterworld, but the German nation, through its Führer, takes command in this world. No one seemed to hear what Hitler was really saying. He was putting himself above God. Just 1 month later, Nazi stormtroopers, called brown shirts for the style of their uniforms, helped college students in Berlin hold a massive book burning. More than 70,000 books with messages said to be threatening to the Reich were destroyed. Thousands of onlookers cheered. Without these threatening books, the Nazis had tighter control over what was taught in their schools. That spring, Alphonse and his friend Heinz Ehrman started school together. But no sooner had they begun than Hitler passed the law against the overcrowding of German schools. The schools were not really overcrowded, they just had too many Jews to please Hitler. Almost immediately, Heinz and the other Jewish children were told to leave. I was sad that we no longer walked to school together each morning, but it was a relief for Heinz. The Jewish kids had been singled out for special treatment by our teacher, Becker, whom we all feared very much. The man was terrifying. He would give us our homework, saying, "If I catch any of you unprepared tomorrow morning, I'll whip you black and blue." He did exactly that. Often we would wet our pants when he yelled, "Bend down for your punishment." Strangely, though, he never whipped the Jewish kids like he did us. He had a special punishment for them. He made them sit in a corner, which he sneeringly called Israel. Becker, like many other people in Wittlich, was both a good Catholic and a good Nazi. He never tried to hide his belief that Jews were different. Once a week, we had racial science class where we learned how and why they were different. Just look at the shape of their noses, he would say. If they are formed like an upside down six, that shows their Jewishness. Becker wanted us to despise the Jews. That was clear. It was the first time I had seen discrimination, but there was no mistaking it. When he told us the Jewish kids would no longer be going to our school, he said, "They have no business being among us true Germans." And then looking straight at me, he added, "No German boy can ever be true friends with a Jewish boy, no matter how nice he seems. He'll grow up to be your enemy." I didn't see how this could be true, but I figured it must be since Becker knew everything. A picture of Adolf Hitler hung in nearly every classroom in the country. Boys and girls by the millions were joining the Hitlerjugend. Adolf Hitler treated young Germans as his trusted helpers. They in turn promised to do anything for him, even die. Of all the branches in the Nazi Party, the Hitler Youth was by far the largest and by far the most fanatic. Its power increased each year. Soon, even our parents became afraid of us. Never in the history of the world has such power been wielded by teenagers. Nazi leaders stressed 2 points by which young people should live. First, they must believe that pure Aryan Germans were better than all other people. Second, they must remember that their primary duty was to Germany and its leaders. Der Fuhrer came first, above family, above friends, above God. Those beliefs were not hard for most young people to follow. In the early years of the Third Reich, membership in the Hitler Youth was by choice. Each boy or girl could decide whether or not to join. Most did. So anxious was Alphonse to join that it seemed to him he would never reach the magic age of 10. Far from being forced to enter, I couldn't wait to join. It promised to be an exciting life filled with duties that were more like pleasures. In a way, it was like the Boy Scouts, hiking, camping, sports competition, with more emphasis on discipline and politics. Until I was old enough to join, I had to content myself with watching the Hitler Youth march in parades through the streets of Wittlich. One spring evening, in the company of my Uncle Franz, I watched a torchlight parade of brown-shirted stormtroopers in Hitler Youth formations. The music of a military band filled the air, the first military music our people had heard since the end of World War I. The streets were draped with red flags and buntings. What would later become a symbol of death, a black swastika within a white circle, was then still new to most of the people in Wittlich. It seemed like the whole town lined the streets that night. People hung from windows and balconies, shouting a constant storm of Heil Hitler and Sieg Heil. At last, we laid eyes on the man who had put us into this wild fever of excitement. He was standing in an open black Mercedes touring car. It was the first time I had ever seen Adolf Hitler, and I will never forget the magic of that night. Even people who were usually quiet and surly were shouting their lungs out, Heil Hitler! Here was the man who was building for us a new Germany, a proud country that would once again find its place in the world. On that night, I was just as certain as Hitler that the Third Reich would last 1,000 years.